afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me all well, and greetings from Djibouti, from the headquarters of IGAD. So as you already have heard, my name is Lena Brenn, and I'm the Disaster Displacement Advisor. And in the next hour, we will focus on disaster displacement, because as you probably all know, one of the biggest impacts of disasters is on the lives of millions of people on the African continent. And in the next session, we will specifically discuss what we can do to better prepare for, prevent, and address disaster displacement. Because in this area, disaster risk reduction policies can play a very important role, because they can help to, one, reduce the risk to become displaced and therefore also displacement to happen. And at least it also reduces the suffering when displacement finally does happen. And you will hear more later throughout the session about the details and the numbers. But just to already give you a flash of the magnitude of disaster displacement in the region, is that in 2020 alone, more than 11 million people were newly displaced by disasters and the adverse effects of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa only. And the region is also considered to be one of the most vulnerable to climate variability and climate change due to its arid and semi-arid land. So this means that we are very often faced with a wide range of natural hazards, such as droughts, floods, landslides, earthquakes, cyclones, and of course also the slow onset climate change effects. And so in this 1 hour session, we aim to then discuss the current understanding of disaster displacement risk in Africa, and also about the different opportunities to integrate disaster displacement into the policy frameworks at the regional and also the national level, which are then, of course, also in line with the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, and specifically also Target E. So this session will also discuss good practices on how to prevent and address disaster displacement at the regional and the national level. So as you already have heard, we will have 5 speakers today, and they will give you an overview about the scale of disaster displacement in sub-Saharan Africa. We will have the opportunity to discuss some concrete tools on how to include disaster displacement into disaster risk reduction policies. And we also will provide some concrete examples from the regional and also from the national level. And at the end, we know that we only have 1 hour's time, but we aim to keep the presentations pretty short to also allow enough time for discussions afterwards. So if you have any questions, please use the chat box function, and we will then respond to these questions after the presentations have ended. And with this, I would like to ask the first speaker, who is from IDMC. IDMC is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And the first speaker will be Ivana Hatzmanova, who is the Regional Coordinator and Sub-Saharan Africa at IDMC. And Ivana will give us an overview about disaster displacement in Sub-Saharan Africa. So Ivana, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Lena, and good afternoon, everyone. I've prepared a few slides, so if I can ask to get the PowerPoint on the screen, and we can start. Thank you. So as Lena said, I will give you a short overview of how the internal displacement looks like in sub-Saharan Africa. I will also give you a few comparisons to the global trends and to how it compares to conflict displacement as well. So as you can see on the first graphic, you can see that conflict and disaster displacement affects the whole subcontinent. You can see the small dots, the orange ones refer to conflict and the blue ones to disasters. So you can see how it spreads across sub-Saharan Africa. And as Elena mentioned at the beginning, in total in 2020, at IDMC, we recorded more than 11 million new displacements linked to both conflict and disasters. And you can see this segregation on top in the circle. where conflict displaced more than 6 million people and disasters more than 4 million people. So you can see that conflict is the major driver of displacement in sub-Saharan Africa. However, disasters are very close to it and also drive millions of new displacements. And when it comes to the top 5 countries on the continent producing IDPs, DRC was the first one, but as you can see again, most of the displacement was linked to conflict. But in countries such as Ethiopia or Somalia, a lot of the displacement was driven by disasters, and in Somalia, it was even the majority of displacement was due to disasters. Now, if we look at the historical data and how the displacement trends have been evolving since 2008, so more than 10 years, you can see that especially the blue lines are on the increase. Since 2014, there has been a steady increase of new displacements driven by disasters. And you can see that how high they reached in 2020. And the only year when the displacement was higher was in 2012, when there was unprecedented flooding in Western Africa, especially Nigeria, which displaced millions of people. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the disaster displacement is higher every year in the region. When we look how it compares to the global trends, you can see that Africa does not produce the highest numbers of displacement related to disasters. Countries in Asia are much more prone to disaster displacement, but you can see that still in the top 10 countries, Somalia is there. So again, it's something of concern. And there are other countries from the region in the top 20 countries from Western Africa, but also Eastern Africa, such as Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mozambique was also very close there. So very high displacement also globally. Now, if you look at the duration of displacement and for how long people remain displaced after disasters hit, this graphic shows you the top 10 countries which recorded people displaced by disasters as of the end of the year. So it means that these people were displaced sometimes during 2020 and remain displaced as of December 2020. So you can see that 4 countries from Africa were in the top 10. And this is, of course, a very worrying trend because sometimes we tend to think that disaster displacement is short-term and that people get displaced by flooding and then after a few weeks they probably return home. But what this data shows us that in at least these 4 countries, but many others which are not in the top 10, people can then get displaced by disasters. In many cases, it's floods and cyclones in these cases. And then they remain displaced for years after disaster strikes. In certain cases, we talk about 3, 4, 5 years, and the people are still not back home. Now, if you look a bit at the future, what we also try to do at IDMC is to measure the risk of disaster displacement. And we have developed a model for the Greater Horn of Africa, which helps us to estimate what is the risk of future displacement in certain countries and for certain triggers. So for the time being, we look at floods, at cyclones and earthquakes. We are also trying to develop a similar model for drought and slow onset disasters, but it's much more complicated, so it will take time, but it's also something we are working on. And here on this graphic, you can see on average, each year how many people could get displaced by disaster in a given country. And you can also see the proportion of different disasters. So you can see floods in blue, then earthquakes and also cyclones. But as you can imagine, for many countries, drought would be a very significant driver, and probably the number of the people at risk would be much, much higher than what you can see on this graphic. And on this point, I would stop the presentation. I'm happy to discuss any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Ivana, for the excellent overview about the scale of disaster displacement in the region. And also thanks for highlighting that very often we oversee that disaster displacement can actually happen over a longer period of time, and not only as we often imagine that this is only for a short term. And of course, I'm sure there are questions also towards the end on you, and of course, you will stay with us, so these questions will be responded at the end. And next, I would like to ask our second speaker, because now we are moving into the session when it is about which tools are existing to include disaster displacement in disaster risk reduction policies. And there are tools available, and we will have two speakers focusing on that question. And the first speaker will be Simon Edison. And Simon is the principal researcher at the International Institute on Environment and Development. And you have already done quite a lot of research in this area and on risk assessment and different practices and tools that are available. And it would be interesting to know from your side what your research has revealed about the types and the approaches and the tools that are being used to conduct these disaster risk assessments. Simon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lena. Yes, so we have been working with UNDRR over the past year or so to do some analysis on the types of tools and approaches that are being used to do disaster displacement risk analysis. But we've been looking at that from a very particular point of view. The UNDRR several years ago, in looking at the disaster displacement challenge, identified a gap in or at least a need within the disaster displacement analysis space for integrating vulnerability into those analyses. And we've been looking over the past year at the extent to which vulnerability and also resilience and adaptive capacity are integrated into existing models and approaches and tools for estimating disaster displacement risk. And what we have found is that while many of these models, and they are many, they range from probabilistic models that look to estimate the likelihood of disaster displacement based on the intersection of a particular hazard, type of hazard, and the exposure of a particular population in a particular place, to other forms of analysis like big data analysis, to systems dynamic analysis and risk indices, for instance. But these different types of analysis tend to be generated at a very high level, so kind of global, regional, or national level, and are becoming more and more, let's say, accurate, or at least have a greater power to be predictive about the numbers of people that might be displaced by certain types of events. But they do not integrate a very robust analysis of the vulnerabilities of particular people in particular places to different types of events, or how they might be affected by displacement. So whether or not particular social groups or particular categories of people are more likely to be displaced than others, or how they are likely to be affected once displaced. The implication of that is that these tools that are being generated using very sophisticated statistical and technological methods don't yet provide the kinds of might be really useful for operational decision-making and planning, let's say at subnational or local level, and particularly within communities. And that's where we at IIED see a real need for more effective and accurate data. As we look at we've just seen a great presentation on the scale of disaster displacement, but one thing that's really important to appreciate is the fact that disaster displacement caused by climatic events and extreme weather events is increasing quite rapidly. The scale and the frequency of those events is increasing. And as climate change picks up pace due to global heating, the incidence of these events is going to increase as well, both in scale and intensity. And those those extreme events, these disasters, are not going to be affecting people in exposed places equally. Communities, the people within communities all have very different vulnerabilities. They all have different levels of adaptive capacity. And the likelihood of becoming displaced depends upon our understanding of those particular capacities and vulnerabilities. Evidence is coming out from places like Bangladesh and Nigeria that the choices that people have to make around whether they will move or not in after a extreme weather event is very much determined by a range of different factors, whether it's their income, their access to assets, their access to social networks, their understanding about what might face them in a new location. So having a detailed understanding of the particular disaggregated vulnerabilities and resilience or adaptive capacities within a community could be really transformational in helping us make much more targeted and accurate decisions about what kinds of disaster risk reduction interventions or what kinds of disaster responses we should launch. So what we're recommending is that disaster risk reduction professionals who are developing these probabilistic models or big data analysis models need to think about generating a next generation of these approaches and tools that can either integrate granular data on vulnerability and adaptive capacity at the household and community level, or work with others that are generating that kind of information, whether it's governments at the local level or NGOs or civil society organizations or communities themselves, to triangulate the macro level analysis of disaster displacement risk with a more fine-grained understanding of what vulnerability looks like. That triangulation of data could help us to make much more accurate assessments of what disaster displacement risk is and serve the needs of those who are actually most vulnerable without putting in place blanket approaches. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later on.
Thanks so much, Simon, for the overview on the research that you led. And as you have said, I think the question on vulnerability is a very important one, especially when we're speaking about models. And as you have said, there are many different models out there. Even you're working on models. IDMC has just mentioned that there are models. We are working with ICPAC and other agencies on models. There is also another initiative like the ACMI, the Africa Climate Initiative. So there is a lot of modeling out there. And of course, the underlying need is actually that we also have the data available and that we are working also with the governments to really have the information accessible and can use this then also to get the needed information that is needed for the use of these models. Thanks a lot for the excellent presentation. And after this, I would like to ask the second speaker in this session about the tools that are available. So the session is, let me quickly check. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. It is from Nelson from NRC in Mozambique. And you will also speak about the tools that are available and that you already have used in the Mozambique context. Let me quickly check again.
Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for having us here. So before I touch base about the tool, there are two things that are important to mention here. The first one is that currently, as Mozambique, we are facing a tremendous increase on the number of IDPs, either created by conflicts, either created by disasters. So these people who are massively being displaced by conflicts, they are at risk of suffering from the second and third type of displacement caused by disasters. So from our side, it was clear when we approached it from the first time that we approached the government that a guideline addressing displacement was needed. So what we did was to approach the government of Mozambique throughout INGD on the 2020, and we discussed about the possibility of producing a guideline addressing disaster displacement. And we find out that willingness, the government of Mozambique had space and was trying to produce this a relatively similar tool, and we worked on making sure that we could start that. This work was possible, of course, throughout NFC, Oxfam South Africa, IOM, and Unit National High Commission for Refugee. So the work, all the process was led by the government of Mozambique throughout the NGD. There was a national and an international expert team which was built to work with the government of Mozambique on producing these national policies for internal displacement management. And there were two processes of consultation. One of them, we produced a small list of questions which we took to the four main vulnerable provinces in Mozambique affected by disaster, and we discussed it with IDPs and with host community about what would be the perspective on developing the national policy and strategy for internal displacement management. The second round after the draft, what we did was to do a consultation with all the key and relevant stakeholders throughout all the country. And these include all the UN, national non-government organization, international non-government organization, and public sectors. So finally, there is a policy and strategy for internal displacement management in Mozambique, which was approved back to August, and in September it was published. So this was possible, as I will say, throughout a collaborative work which the WIA project in Mozambique, including Oxfam South Africa, NFC, and other partners, IOM and UNHCR did. But particularly, this was the role that the WIA checklist had on influencing and lobbying throughout the government to use this policy and strategy. So in terms of tools, what we do have, there is a WIA guideline which was developed in 2019. That is it. It was developed by UNHCR in 2019 throughout a collaborative effort and with the support of Federal Foreign Office for the German, Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Swedish. So the WIA guideline offer a practical actions to address disaster displacement and DRR strategies, particularly regarding to the Sendai Thermal Target A policy law, including for climate change, sustainable development, and sector planning. So in terms of practical guidance, the WIA guideline, it brings guidance to reduce displacement risk, also to protect the right of displaced people and help them to find durable solutions. This is one of the general tools that we have. And following that, we do have I think that this is the slide, we do have the WIA checklist. The checklist was launched back this year, and it helps assess whether policy and the practice are aligned with the Sendai framework on displacement, and also on identifying gaps and priority on addressing disaster displacement. So, in terms of disaster risk management cycle, the checklist is structured in a way of having a complete process of addressing displacement. This was actually, just to point out something, when we approached the government of Mozambique, the idea from the government was to develop a guideline for resettlement. So our discussion starting on ensuring that together with the government, instead of developing only regulation for resettlement zones, we could start by developing guideline or policy or strategy which could address all the process and cycle of disaster risk management, particularly regarding to IDP. So the checklist offer understanding and practice from action from the understanding of displacement, preparedness, strengthening governance, response, support, resilience of displaced population, and also on finding solutions, on finding durable solution for the IDPs. So in terms of the second tool, which is related with the WIA guidelines, is the e-learning system course on disaster displacement. The course takes 5 hours. It's based on an interactive scenario-based exercises. It's in English and Spanish, in French, and Arabic. We will be translating these maybe in final. I do think that we might already have the French version, but in Arabic next year that will be available also. The course will be available in Arabic. So the course can be accessible via online and offline, and it's for everyone who direct during his work finds on the need to address disaster displacements. So the WIA project is currently being used by the WIA guideline. I would say it's currently being used not only by countries but also with some regions. To make some example, to point some example for the countries, the Shield government, the South Africa government is kind of finalizing the guideline on disaster displacement. The Mozambique government already published that in Nepal. So on this particular set of countries, we are helping them to develop disaster displacement guideline and policy. Likely to Mozambique, it took only 1 year on producing this policy, which will help a lot. Consider, for instance, that the forestry diet state that we do have currently 1.5 million of people at risk of displacement as a result of the upcoming rain season. In terms of region, we have IGAD, we have Andrea and Central American region. There we are helping, we are working with the regional bodies, IGAD, coverage, and we're also offering training based on the WIA guideline checklist and e-learning course. So throughout the WIA project, supports are available to country in the region. One, to integrate element or to related to disaster, to address disaster displacement in DRR, climate change, and sectoral policy, or to develop new policy or strategy on disaster displacement, which was the case of Mozambique, for instance. Also, there is support which can be which is related to receiving training on policymaker and DRR actors on disaster displacement based on a WIA guideline and the checklist, including the e-learn course. So the slide PowerPoint that you are seeing now, there are 2 pictures. The second picture, it's a group of people doing the e-learn course, and the first one is the process of consultation and finalization of the policy and strategy for internal displacement management in Mozambique, where the WIA projects, to mention Oxfam and NRC, Oxfam South Africa and NRC, also other partners, IOM and the UNHCR, we worked together with the government of Mozambique and producing this national policy strategy for internal displacement management. So I will just stop here. If there is any question, please feel free to address, and I'm here to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nelson, for the overview, and also about speaking about the words into action on disaster displacement. That is really a very useful tool to show how you can include displacement in existing disaster risk reduction policies, or if this is not possible, then make new policies, like this was the case in Mozambique. I think that is extremely useful to know, and I think everyone who is not aware of these words into action guide, I think you should also have the link in the chat box function so that you can have a look at it, because it is really a very a very interesting and very useful tool. And of course, it should not stay at the level of being a tool. It should also make sure that it is implemented at the national and the local level. So it is already a great example in Mozambique. And we will continue now with the session on how we are using these tools at the regional and the national level. And the first one who will speak in this regard is a presentation from Madame Fatia Alouane, who is the Director of Health and Social Development at IGAD. And unfortunately, Madame Fatia was not available to attend this session today, but she was very happy to do a recording of her speech, and also to give us a little bit of an idea on what is being done at the regional level to address disaster displacement in disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. And so maybe I will ask the organizers to put the video from Madame Fatia Alouane on the screen. Thank you.
Distinguished delegates, partners, ladies and gentlemen. This regional platform on disaster risk reduction is a very important meeting, and as a IGAD, we are very glad to co-organize a session that is dedicated to disaster displacement. In the IGAD region, one of the main challenges we are facing is the high number of people affected by frequent disaster as droughts, floods, landslides, and other natural hazards, primarily due to the climate variability and also climate change in the region. Also, with the 2/3 of the IGAD region being an arid or semi-arid, and that also majority of the population in the IGAD region are dependent on highly vulnerable livelihood based such as pastoralism and subsistence, small-scale farming, the region often reports very high number of people affected and displaced. The figures by the International Displacement Monitoring Center show so that in 2020, almost 3 million people in the region were newly displaced by disaster and the adverse effect that climate change in the IGAD region. And also other disaster displacement occurs in places already affected by conflict and violence. For this reason, investing in disaster risk reduction policies and also action is a key, because also they can help to prevent and reduce the risk of displacement and also strengthen the resilience of affected community. And ladies and gentlemen, for this reason, investing in disaster risk reduction policies and action is a key, because they can also help to prevent and reduce the risk of displacement, but also strengthen the resilience of affected community. In the previous presentation, we have also heard the different tools that are available to better integrate human mobility consideration in disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. At IGAD, we're also committed to support our member state into the implementation of these tools in order to better prepare them for prevent and also respond to disaster displacement. In the interest of time, I will only focus on 2 key areas. First, we are supporting the inclusion of disaster displacement across different policy areas to ensure a holistic approach. For example, building on the work's into action guide on disasters displacement, we also undertook a policy mapping to assess how displacement and other forms of human mobility is currently addressed in the IGAD member state policy on disaster risk reduction, climate change, and development. These results from this study were also discussed with the member state in September of this year. And in the next step, we are supporting the member state to better address disaster displacement in the national and local policies and strategies. We also offered the online training on disaster displacement that was mentioned in the previous presentation to the IGAD member state. The second area is also would like to mention today is on data and knowledge on human mobility, disaster, and climate change. Here, IGAD, we're working very closely with the IGAD Climate Change Prediction and Application Center, ICPAC, to better link the climate data and also the seasonal forecast with displacement and migration data, and also to develop a disaster risk displacement models together with several partners. This also action will help us to better map, understand, and also predict human mobility on the context of disaster and climate change, including the risk of displacement. These are only two examples on how we aim to support our member state to better prepare for, prevent, and respond to disaster displacement in the region. Exchange like the one today offer a great opportunity to learn from experience from our other region, our member state and partners. I wish everyone for a fruitful discussions. Thank you.
So after this presentation from Madame Fatia Alwan from IGAD, I will go to the national level. And before also we are doing that, also, of course, if there are any questions that are going towards IGAD and also ICPAC, both myself and my colleague Ahmed Amdihun from ICPAC are here to respond to these questions. So don't hesitate also to put your questions into the chat box function if there are any questions on the presentation from Madame Fatia. And next, we're going to the national level, as I just mentioned. We will have an example from Uganda. And also, I would like to thank the representative from Uganda to step in very last minute. So it will be Emmanuel Okecho, who is the Disaster Preparedness Officer from the Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda, who will make the presentation on behalf of Uganda. And from your side, it would be very interesting to know what kind of lessons and practices Uganda is taking to address disaster displacement, and how you're taking this into account into the strategies and into the practices. And it would be very useful to know and to learn from your experience. Emmanuel, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremony. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As already mentioned, Emmanuel Okecha, my name, stepping in to discuss the displacement from the Uganda's experience. What I could say is that displacement in Uganda is both internal and external. Internal displacement meaning Ugandan citizens or residents being displaced within their country. But Uganda has also had an open-hand policy. We receive our brothers and sisters who are displaced due to various reasons from the neighboring countries in the region. Of course, the major driving factors, as already mentioned by the previous presenters, is that we are receiving these people who are being displaced from across the national boundaries. They are coming as a result of climate change effects in their countries and also conflicts. What is important to note is that most of the internal displacements within the country are as a result of climate change and related impacts, not conflicts. To begin with, the approaches being used or the strategies in place, way back between 1980s and early 2000s, we had a conflict in the country, in the northern part of the country. And this conflict is so almost the whole sub-region move into displacement. So government came in with a strategy to manage the internal conflict, to have people put in camps. And of course, those who are not able to be in camps and who are able to make their way out of the affected sub-region, who are displaced out of that sub-region, that is northern Uganda. And to better manage the impact of this displacement, government had to come up with a national policy for the internally displaced persons in 2004. So meaning that what we need, the first and the most powerful tool is the national commitment. We need to have the policy in place to guide us, to help us manage issues of displacement in a better and a coordinated manner. This policy is enshrined in the office of the Prime Minister, and it is what guided the response and the management of the internal displacement at that time. Now, as this issue of conflict in the country was being managed, disaster risks were becoming more and more pronounced in the country. So government pursued another policy on the management of National Policy for Disaster Preparedness and Management of 2011. So this one provides for the management and the coordinated and response to disasters, including displacement as an impact of disasters. So government did not stop at that. The other policy option that was taken was a deliberate affirmative action, a deliberate action to put in place a fund to help in responding to issues of displacement and also to manage situations that would lead to displacement before people are actually displaced. So this is what we call the contingency fund, which is 1.5% of the previous year's budget set aside to respond to issues of natural disasters. So experience has shown us that at times timely response to this disaster effect helps to prevent displacement issues. However, occasionally we get overwhelmed. And if we don't respond in time, we still end up with the people getting displaced internally. So what we are also doing as one of the deliberate actions is to fast track the resettlement of persons known to be living in high risk places. For example, the landslide prone regions of Uganda in the east and in the southwestern. So we are fast tracking the resettlement of these persons so that persons who would rather be displaced by disasters are resettled to safer areas before the disasters even occur. Of course, we are being also challenged in that respect by the large numbers of people to attend to vis-a-vis the resources available. But efforts are underway to fast track that kind of intervention. In practice, there are also interventions that we have put in place, because before you plan to respond to issues of displacement, before you manage the displacement, you need to know the numbers. Now, how are we doing this? Our policy, the National Policy for Disaster Preparedness and Management of 2011, creates a structure called the District Disaster Management Committee. Our brothers in Ethiopia call it the WAREDAs, the District Disaster Management Committees. So this committee is charged with the responsibility of collecting data and updating Office of the Prime Minister monthly on issues of displacement within their district, if there are any. Of course, there are periods that can go without any issue of displacement being recorded. So alongside this, with our partners like IOM, we produce a monthly information sheet, what we call the infographic. I can, I think, share a screenshot if time allows. So this information sheet provides us with the statistics of persons displaced, the location of displacement, and the hazard that has caused the displacement. This is also updated monthly using information from the different sources, including the District Disaster Management Committee, information collected by Uganda Red Cross Society, and of course the IOM itself. The relocation of persons who are threatened with the displacement or with the disaster effects is being done in a manner that actually provides an incentive to the persons who would rather be stuck in one place and get affected by disasters. For example, if it was a rural community, they are now being resettled in a semi-urban community given the kind of housing and infrastructure provided, because the houses have got running water as opposed to the rural communities where they were. It has got electricity connected as opposed to the communities where they were before. And of course, good roads. So it's actually beginning to attract people to accept to move. These are the few experiences we can share from Uganda. But the lesson learned is that there should be an incentive to avoid displacement. I think it can be avoided if you can provide incentives for the persons likely to be affected to move away ahead of time. That is in response to the natural disasters. The other, in response to the conflict, I think strengthening early warning is far better, because when you inform people early, it is possible that they can relocate themselves without waiting to be displaced. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for the really excellent presentation. And I think, as we have seen, I think you from the Ugandan side, you're really a prime example on what can be done, and there is a lot that can be done. And I think it's like, especially on the fact that you actually have a fund that is available, that is specifically available in the case that a disaster happens, and also when people get displaced, that there is funding available. I think this is an excellent example on what can be done, and that you really have this specific budget allocation available. And also, thanks for highlighting the activities that you're doing when it comes to resettlement and relocation. And also, we know, I mean, everyone is aware of the fact that really permanently relocate people is a very difficult task. And as you have said, like providing schools, providing really good roads, and providing housing and all these kind of things are extremely important, that the people are also willing to relocate and are not staying in the areas that are at risk of disasters. And the last point that you mentioned, which is extremely useful and important, as we have heard already from several presentations, is the need to have good data that is available on the disasters, but also data that is available on how many people are displaced. And it is great to see that you actually have the structure in place so that you do have the statistics available that will afterwards also inform all the different actions to take place. So with this, I'd like to thank again all the presenters who have spoken until now. And we are entering into the question and answers session. And here, before we are taking the questions from the floor, I would also like to ask another representative from Mozambique, Mr. Higinio Rodriguez, and apologies if I pronounced the name not in the correct way. And it would be nice if you could also, again, on what Nelson has already said, what you're doing in Mozambique, provide a little bit more of an examples on what concretely you are doing to include displacement in your strategies and policies. And maybe also to mention, I think the presentation will be in Portuguese. So afterwards, we will also have our colleague Nelson, who will then quickly put this into the translated version in English. Thank you.
Thank you. I will do it in a few words. It's in Portuguese. Nelson will help me. Yeah. Era só para dizer mesmo que a política, Moçambique já aprovou a política e estratégia de gestão de deslocados e que já foi terminada e foi publicada há mais ou menos 2-3 meses. Portanto, estou a falar de agosto e publicado em setembro. Nós agora desenvolvemos também um plano de disseminação, portanto, que temos que levar até ao mais recôndito do nosso país, para que exatamente para poder fazer a disseminação. E são os próximos 2 anos e meio que temos que fazer essa disseminação, E contamos com o apoio da NRC, da Oxfam Sul-Africana, com a OIM e outros parceiros que já desde a elaboração estiveram conosco. Agora, nós convidamos a todos mesmo, todos, mais alguns, para poderem juntarem-se a nós e mais parceiros, que é para podermos fazer a implementação desta política e estratégia de gestão de deslocados. Muito obrigado.
Thanks a lot. And maybe, Nelson, you can quickly put these words into the English. Thank you.
I mean, just to summarize it, this was a call from the government of Mozambique, represented by INTD, to call for the partners, for those who are practitioners of disaster displacement, to come up and join us on this process of starting the operationalization, dissemination, and implementation of the policy and the strategy for disaster displacement management. We do have a 2.5-year action plan, which we will be working together with INGT on making sure that this is implemented. To mention that throughout a recommendation from high level of the government of Mozambique, particularly considering the cabinet of the president of the country, we were recommended to take it, to disseminate it to the first respondent of disaster displacement in the districts or in the interior of Mozambique. That's why we'll be taking it to the most recorded areas in Mozambique. That was the sum of what the Dr. Engenho was saying, and I would like to thank him to come up as a representative of the government of Mozambique to support this process of also talking a little bit about the policy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nelson, for the translation. And with this, we will go to the questions that were put into the chat. And I will start with questions first to IDMC and also to Simon from IIED. So the first question, or there are several questions for IDMC. So one is about the gender dimension of those displaced in Africa, and whether you have any information available on the gender issues. And maybe this is also a question that can also be taken from other presenters. So if you have any information available that we do have specific interventions on gender, then please also let us know later. And the second question towards IDMC is why has drought not been considered for the displacement forecast? And for example, IDPs within Somalia, for example, are largely displaced due to the recurring drought. So maybe you can also elaborate a little bit more on what you have said already before on the models that you have available on drought. And then the question to Simon is a little bit more on how the vulnerability factors are utilized in the tool to predict. And the person who asked the question was also saying that he understands, or she understands, that risk analysis is key in understanding the risk of displacement. And that should encompass the analysis on the hazard, the analysis of the exposure, and the analysis of the vulnerability to produce an index or a parameter, or maybe this will then be utilized as an input into the probabilistic model. So I think this is a very specific question on modeling, and I think it would be useful if you could elaborate a little bit more on that one. So maybe I would ask the two of you first to respond to these questions, and then we are coming to the other questions for the other speakers. So maybe first to Ivana, if you can take the first question.
Thank you so much, Lena, and thank you to the audience for those excellent questions. So regarding the first one on the gender aspect of displacement, so at IDMC we do collect data on gender related to displacement, and the data varies depending on the availability in each country and how each of the data collectors work. So it depends on what country you're interested in, but I would just like to invite you to reach out to us if you are interested in specific country, specific trigger, and the gender aspect, and we can see what we have in our internal database and how useful for you. But we do have this data. And regarding the question on a drought, so when we report on displacement, we do include drought as one of the triggers of displacement, and we do have information on drought-induced displacement in Eastern Africa, but also in Southern Africa. When it comes to the risk model and the predictions, we are trying to include drought into it. However, it's a bit more complicated than to predict displacement related to floods or landslides and so on. So we are working on including it in the model. We are collaborating with several partners, and hopefully in the months or maximum years to come, drought will be also included in there.
Thanks so much, Ivana, for responding to these questions in a very short time, because I also see that time is running out. So maybe, Simon, if you can also respond in a very short and concise manner to the very specific question. Thank you.
The questioner is quite right that trying to establish disaster displacement risk levels does indeed require us to look both at the hazard, the type of hazard that is likely to occur, when it might occur, and to what degree, as well as the exposure of the population and their vulnerability. And we can also include within that equation their capacity to cope, adapt, or to be resilient to the impact of that hazard. Just speaking to the probabilistic risk assessments that are the most popular and most powerful of the tools that we reviewed, they do include vulnerability to a degree. The focus is largely on, if a certain hazard happens in this place, what is the likely impact on this population as a whole? Vulnerability in that regard is only integrated into the model as a proxy indicator. And the most common proxy indicator that's used is housing damage or structural damage. Now, that is fine insofar as it goes, but it really gives us it's a very blunt piece of data for giving us any detailed understanding about the vulnerability within the population. And equally, it's only really useful for looking at the impact of hazards that are going to cause structural damage. So the question that was raised about drought is really important when it comes to this, because drought doesn't impact structures, it impacts people. So that's why we need to integrate into these models a different set of indices that can provide us with that detailed disaggregated data about the specific vulnerabilities, so how people are going to be affected, but also their ability to cope with or to be resilient to a particular hazard. I'll leave it at that, Lena.
Thanks so much, Simon. And I see the time is running, but we also have one question that is actually for IGAD. And this question I would just quickly respond to because I try to be as concise as possible. So there is one question that is whether it is recommended for IGAD to provide information on the drought situation, its effects and conflicts associated to it to the member states. And here I can just say, like, one very concrete example, and I also invite the person who asked this question to look into the ICPAC website, because there is actually a drought monitor available from ICPAC site. So it is actually a system that monitors all the drought situation and gives, and it is kind of a live map that shows the different scenarios, at least for the IGAD region. And also in this regard, of course, what we are doing right now is that, of course, on one hand, you can have like the drought situations and you can show what is most likely to happen at level. But what is a little bit of the link of the missing gap is that we need to combine this, of course, also with the data that is linked to displacement and other forms of human mobility. So what we are doing right now is that we are, together with ICPAC and other partners, IMCs, of course, also included there, when it comes to drought monitoring and forecasting and predictions, is that we really try to bring together the data on human mobility and the data on all the different forms of disasters, no matter what, like there are different forms. We're having like one model on slow onset and we are having another model on sudden onset disasters. And we really try to bring these angles together. And I think this also, just like in 30 seconds more, also to respond to another question on how we can actually then integrate disaster reduction in all these different forms. And here, at least from IGAD side, what we are doing is that we are trying to have a holistic approach. So because disaster displacement is, of course, touching on all different policies. So this is why we are trying to integrate displacement into the disaster risk reduction policies, as we have discussed just right now. But on the other hand, we are also trying to integrate issues that are related to climate change and that can become disasters in the future, also integrate these issues into the policies on migration and on displacement. And with this, I think the time is over. It was a very useful discussion, and I hope everyone can take something out of it. And I want to wish everyone a nice evening. And thanks a lot for participating in this session. And of course, also, I wish everyone to have tomorrow another good discussion, and on Friday, of course, as well. Thanks a lot to everyone for their attention, and good evening. Bye.